I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is a special bonus episode of Headlights Voices from the Progressive South. As promised on this week's regular episode, we're presenting a fuller version of my interview with singer-songwriter Adeem the artist. If you listen to the main episode, you will hear some segments repeated here, but the longer edit gives them more context. We recorded this interview at my dining room table in Knoxville. At one point, we're joined by the household cat, Sid. I'll be interjecting a few times to provide context. One thing to note in the first section is that Adeem refers to local racial justice protests after the death of a boy named Anthony Thompson Jr., a black high school student who was shot and killed by police during a confrontation in a school bathroom. If you want to hear more of Adeem's music and learn more about them, you can find it all at their website, adeemtheartist.com. To get us started, let's hear a clip from their most recent album, Anniversary. They have described the song One Night Stand as an effort to write a 90s Nashville pop country song about a same-sex relationship. Adeem the artist is a country folk rock singer-songwriter based here in Knoxville, Tennessee. They are non-binary and use they-them pronouns, which we will of course be using in our conversation. Adeem was born in North Carolina and grew up there and in Syracuse, New York. They grew up in the church, and their early forays into music were predominantly religious. They moved to Knoxville 15 years ago, and over time their musical, personal, and political identities have shifted considerably, as the title of their 2021 album, Cast Iron Pansexual, suggests. That was followed by the album White Trash Revelry in 2022 and Anniversary in 2024. They have received acclaim and made Best of the Year lists in outlets like Rolling Stone, Billboard, The New York Times, and National Public Radio. Adeem is part of a wave of queer country artists in recent years who are working to broaden the boundaries of a genre that has long been seen as the province of a default cultural conservatism. For Adeem, that carries over into the topics of their songs, which have addressed issues like racial injustice, religious intolerance, and queer identity. We will talk about some of all of that, and I'm very happy to welcome Adeem to the podcast. Thanks for coming. Always a pleasure to see you.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, friend. I appreciate you.
Can you talk a little about your upbringing and your cultural roots? I think one thing that's really vital about your music is that you really assert a sense of belonging in country music in the South that's obviously fraught, but is also very deeply rooted.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about being a seventh-generation Carolinian, and that's, my family's been in the Carolinas for as long as there have been white people, which is not a flex. But I grew up in Gastonia. That's where I was born. And then I moved to Locust, North Carolina, which is a really small town on the other side of Charlotte. My dad worked running the lathe at a machine shop, and then he worked mowing lawns on the weekends to kind of make ends meet. And my mom, she'd do, one time, she used to pick up weird jobs, like she'd put pantyhose and eggs for the machines, you know what I mean? And we get these big boxes of eggs and pantyhose, and she'd be like, all right, we're watching La Femme Nikita and doing pantyhose tonight, kids. And so we'd put the pantyhose in the eggs. But yeah, it was, we always had a bunch of kittens running around. The driveway was lined with pecans, and so when the squirrels would come, they'd pelt us with the pecans, and then we'd crack them and fill grocery bags with them for the mailman and the trash man and everybody for the holidays. And grew up around my grandma and my aunt and uncle down there in Carolina. And then when I was probably 12 years old, we moved to Baldwinsville, and then I got to kind of be like a redneck. And, I was always an outsider in the South. And then when I moved to Baldwinsville and went to school up there, it was like they didn't have an archetype for somebody like me, I was just kind of the accent, whereas in the South I was just kind of a queer person. I had long bleached blonde hair and trip pants, and I was not an easy to understand person in small town North Carolina, and it didn't get easier in Baldwinsville, New York, I would say. And so that was kind of, my mom had a lot of mental illness, and my father also endured a lot of abuse. So I grew up kind of in a lot of generational trauma, kind of working my way through. I don't know. I mean, I think this is true of everybody. You get born with these things, you got with these problems to solve. You know what I mean? And there are archetypes for all the different roles you're taught you have to play to take care of your family and to take care of yourself and become the person you want to be and all that. But I think that for me, especially when I returned to the South in my early 20s, there was a real reckoning with identity, you know, because I had not identified with being from the South. I identified with being a folk singer in Syracuse. And I had done a lot of work to get rid of my accent. You know, I wanted to be cerebral and sophisticated and all of that. And so by the time I made it back to the South, I think I was feeling really misplaced. And I went to a synagogue for a couple of years, started learning Hebrew. It was a Messianic synagogue, so I was the music director there. And I was learning all about Judaism. I practiced the holidays and everything for a couple of years, and then I stopped believing in Jesus. So then I was going to leave Messianic Judaism to explore regular Judaism. And then I discovered Sufi mysticism and made a hard left turn after very nearly joining a Zionist cult. And then, I got to a point where I was ready to convert to Islam, and one of the key things you have to say is that Muhammad was the last true prophet of God. And I thought, well, if I'm going to say that, I might as well say Jesus rose from the dead. You know, I think prophecy is the living, active thing, you know. And so that led me into a series of discovery with Christian mysticism and John Shelby Spong, Matthew Fox, recently David Dark, theologians who really spoke to a sort of humanist view of the world that really appealed to me, you know. And so I think in all of that, there became, from a very young age, because of my Christianity, because of the generational trauma I was born into, because of the shift from the South to the North to the South, seeing the similarities and the differences in all these places and understanding the way that the histories affected them, I think there was, from a very young age, a real sense of responsibility to address those things and to try and resolve them. And so when I went into doing genealogical work, because I was very kind of cut off from my family, just being the way things were. I didn't have access to a lot of folks. And doing that work, you know, there's a lot of folks that are I think nervous to get into it, you know, to find out that their family owned slaves or were Confederate soldiers or what, you know, it might be embarrassing. And for me it was like, I don't care what I find, because whatever I find tells me what work I have to do, you know. And what I found was that I did have a lot of Confederate soldiers in my family, you know. And to me, there was something about, I had a great grandfather that died in Knoxville fighting for the Confederacy, and I didn't have any connection to Knoxville before I came here. And so I remember marching in the aftermath of Anthony Thompson Jr.'s murder for Black Lives Matter, and marching down Cumberland Avenue, which is where, you know, the Union or the Confederate soldiers would enlist on either side of the street down there where the campus is now, and having my fist in the air knowing this is where my kin would have enlisted to fight. You know what I mean? That's a small symbol of a thing, but that's also an example of what I'm talking about. I think there is a real sense of responsibility in not just in asking the question, like, biblically I have to honor my ancestors, but what does it mean to honor your ancestors when they do dishonorable things? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to honor your ancestors when they subjugate, when they pillage, when they steal, when they dehumanize, you know what I mean? When they appropriate entire identities, and then completely remove the people they appropriated the identities from ever being able to profit from or live inside of those identities. And I think the only way to honor that is to call it what it is, and to hold space for the reality of those things. And historically, we were just talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, like when he talks about the people who think they are white have engineered their own forgetting. To me, that is a thing I have to take account for. And also, I think a lot of people do this because they think it's the right thing. And nobody talks about that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of folks are rewriting history because they genuinely believe it'll be better for everybody if we all believe a myth that satisfies the sense of peace and equity that we all long for.
Right. We won't feel the pain if we forget that it happened.
Yes. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work, And so I think holding the complexity of that and knowing that, like, part of my responsibility is to hold attention to the fact that my ancestors have done horrible things. And I'm not here to make judgments on them as people or their character. I'm only here to make right what was made wrong, because that's my ancestral responsibility. That's the work of my life, is to try and offset that trauma as best I can. And so I think that's kind of a good framework for the work that I do, and how kind of growing up the way that I did informed that.
And your gender identity, like you talked about, having long hair, not feeling like you fit in. At what point did that sink into you that, maybe this is because I guess, when did you even acquire the vocabulary to think and talk about that?
Yeah, not until my mid to late 20s. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't really get exposed to trans people outside of a bit, you know what I mean? And all the gender expansive people that I knew growing up were folks like Prince and David Bowie, who also kind of offhandedly held pretty regressive ideas about gender and sexuality that were clearly informed by some self-loathing and the culture and everything. I was talking to my cousin because he's about 20 years older than me, and he's gay. And when I was growing up, he came by the house one time, and my dad was like, "Hey, I don't want," to my mom, he was like, "Hey, I don't want him coming around the house anymore. I don't want it around my kid. I don't want him turning gay or whatever." And so my mom asked Eric if they could go hang out, somewhere else. And my cousin was like, "I'm in your life or I'm not. Like, I don't want to be a prop for you to use outside the house. If I can't be a part of your life, I don't want to be a part of your life." So I never met him growing up, really, outside of once or twice at family gatherings. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we kind of reconnected and talked a little bit. And when the New York Times piece came out about my gender, he immediately reached out, and he was like, "I'm so proud of you, and I'm so happy you turned out gay anyway." It's very, very funny to him. But
Which is a very old story, right? Like,
oh yeah.
You don't keep people from being gay or trans or non-binary
Absolutely.
by keeping them from knowing about it.
But we were talking about, all the ways, we didn't, either of us feel like we came into our own until we were in our early 30s, And it was like, well, yeah, of course not. How are you supposed to find yourself when the entire world is telling you you can look anywhere but there? And that's what it is. It's like for 30 years, I can, oh, hello, friend.
We've been joined by the cat of the household. This is Sid.
Hello, Sid. Ezra Pound would never feed the cafe cat. That's something.
That's how you know he was a bad guy.
Yeah. I don't remember. I think it was Lewis Hyde who talks about it as a Hemingway quote from something. I don't think it's the Immovable Feast. It's something else. But Hemingway says Ezra Pound never feeds the cafe cat. Maybe it's T.S. Eliot. I don't remember. Anyway, That was not the worst thing about Ezra Pound, obviously, but anyway, yeah, I think about that. I mean, I remember hearing the term non-binary and hearing people say they didn't identify with the gender binary when it was in my late 20s, and thinking like, no, I don't either. I never have. You know, I shopped in the girls section for clothes a lot when I was in high school. I wore eyeliner. I painted my nails, and that was kind of a common part of like emo culture and like scene kid stuff. But also, like, I think probably every generation has some iteration of like gender play that is socially acceptable. You know, like when I think about Dee Snider, you know, it feels like very akin to that. Like, it's okay. You can just, you know, you look at dudes in the 80s who like now are complaining about their kids, and it's like, I don't know if you're a guy or girl in this photograph.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe we could talk about that, you know. And so, I think at the time I had a real sense of, I think that it's a liberal arts informed perspective to be very precious about social identities. And so I think there was a long time where I was really hesitant to think about coming out as queer, because like I was married for a long time to a cis woman, and we had a assumedly heteronormative relationship, and so it just kind of felt like a bunch of busyness to talk about it. And then with pronouns, you know, there was kind of a similar thing. It was like, well, I don't want to be tedious. I don't want to be difficult. I'd changed my name before, and people did not take it well. You know, I still get razzed for changing my name all the time, even though I've been Adeem for 20 years. And that's not to say that it didn't exist either, because I read Judith Butler. You know, I've gone through you know, Billy Tipton and a history of trans people who have been in America making great art and being part of society for a long time, and it's always the same kind of and nobody knew he was trans. You know, like some people knew.
Yeah.
Some people knew. I mean, he had a family, you know, he had kids. Somebody knew he was trans. You know what I mean? It's a very interesting erasure of the tight-knit communities that we have when it's told through the lens of like cisgendered people. But I think that album, Cast Iron Pansexual, was so much me trying to find a way to talk about my sexuality that didn't feel like I was just like trying to browbeat about being queer to get gay points or something, or social identity points, and the, you know.
Right. You're trying to sort of like break down walls but respect boundaries at the same time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so as I'm looking at the idea of talking about my gender, you know, there's a good 5 years where if I'm talking to somebody who is using they, them pronouns or neo-pronouns and non-binary, I'm saying things like, yeah, I don't identify with the binary either. I agree with you about all this. I'm not going to construct a new barrier between me and other people by inviting this type of language change, you know. And then there comes a point where I get connected with this community of queer country musicians all across America, in New Zealand, in Australia, all in the UK. I mean, this is people who have felt alone in rural communities forever during COVID get stitched together through all of us being online so much. And for the first time, there's some semblance of an infrastructure for like trans people within this world of roots music. And it's at this point that I get introduced to Patrick Haggerty from Lavender Country and Karen Pittleman from Karen and the Sorrows, Paisley Fields, Julie Nolan out in Austin, Texas. Like, there's Andrew Saw in Chicago. There are these centers of community all across these like major cities that got connected for the first time, and they found out they weren't alone. And there's something really special about this happening. And when it happens, I all of a sudden begin reviewing trans and queer artists. The first album I reviewed was by Sidney Bullins, who formerly was Cindy Bullins. His press kit is full of this type of information. It was very conflicted for me because I have very neo-trans relationship with terminologies, pronouns, all that stuff. And people who have been trans for 10 years or more don't have that same, you know what I mean? Like, to dead name someone in this current climate is really, really taboo, and yet Sidney Bullins is like, yeah, I was Cindy now, and now I'm Sydney, you know. But he was famous in the 70s for singing the parts on the Grease soundtrack that people think are Olivia Newton-John. I mean, like, he's been Elton John's main backup singer for years. He's made records with T-Bone Burnett. He's a legend, you know. And there's a whole other story here about being 6 feet from the spotlight, you know, that is a tale as old as this industry. But there's also just the fact that, like, he came out and kind of got erased in so many ways. I mean, he hasn't gotten a single slot at Americana Fest. How do you know, Patrick Haggerty? Patrick Haggerty died 2 years ago now, I think. He'd been submitting. He never got accepted into Americana Fest. Like, how do you not let the guy who was making, like, queer country music in 1972 play your fucking woke country event?
Right. I mean, you would think that because Americana, you know, I think we kind of think of it as, it's sort of like the liberal NPR category of country, right? If any place is going to be welcoming, you would think that would be it.
Exactly. But there's so much. I mean, you know, we talked about, there's no reason to reference this. So many people want the appearance of equity and, you know, diversity more than they actually want those things, you know. It's like more important to be seen as one of the good people than it is to do justice, which is fine. That's always been the case. But coming into that world and especially getting immersed in how many young people there were and how gender was affecting them, and then kind of through doing that record of, like, processing my sexuality, really reckoned with, like, all the ways that I had been groomed, you know, from birth to, like, be a man, you know. I mean, I wear this costume, like, a lot of the time because it's like, it helps me navigate life in the South. It makes me connect with people well. But ultimately, like, when COVID happened and I didn't have to wear the costume anymore, you know, it suddenly became clear to me all the ways that I had been invisible, you know, and all the ways that I had been, I mean, even my marriage, you know, they talk about us queer and trans folks being groomers, but it's like, I was taught from a very young age that marrying a cisgendered, straight, white Christian girl and starting a family was the only way I can have happiness in this life. And that was not challenged for me until I'd been married for nearly a decade. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's wild. You know?
Well, it's like, you know, there's this phrase that they use on the right, gender ideology. We're getting rid of gender ideology. It's like, we all grow up with gender ideology. Gender ideology is baked into our culture and our society. And it's not just ours. Like, obviously, different cultures and societies around the world have their own iterations of it.
Yes.
But almost everybody grows up within these, you know, very defined cultural roles we're supposed to inhabit.
Yes. And I mean, I remember when my kid was little, my dad said, I'm really worried that you're not going to let him be a boy. Because I was already using they, them pronouns with Isley. We've never made a big deal about anything, but it's like, yeah, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to wear, whatever games you want to get into, whatever hobbies you're interested in, you know what I mean? We try very hard not to gender any of it. It's like whatever feels right. Even pronouns, I mean, for the first probably 5 years of Isley's life, you know, weekly, we'd be like, hey, checking in about these pronouns, what feels right, you know? And it was like week to week. I think I'm going to try he, him. I think I'm going to try she, her. I think I'm going to try they, them, you know, and my kid would experience the way people treated them differently based on which pronouns they told. You know what I mean? Like, that's a lot of real world experience that my kid got in understanding gender and understanding presentation and you know, and so when my father said that to me, I told him, I said, you know, I'm going to let my kid be whatever my kid wants to be and whatever feels comfortable for my kid. Because I know that what my dad means is, I'm not going to make him be a boy. Because that's what my dad did. And my dad did this from a place of care. You know, like, I mean, you know. You raise your kids to occupy a world you want to be real.
On their second album, 2022's White Trash Revelry, Adeem also brought their growing awareness of racial history to bear on several songs. They said it was important to ground it in their own direct experiences, including watching a Ku Klux Klan rally on the streets of their hometown as a child, which was opposed by black counter-protesters from a group called the All People's Congress. Adeem said their father explained the two factions as being, quote, two sides of the same coin, a false equivalency that Adeem tackles directly in a song called Heritage of Arrogance.
That's the kind of bullshit our daddy said to you and me. But I've been listening, trying to keep myself from dismissing perspectives that I struggle to relate with. And I've been learning our true history and I hate it.
And so I wrote this song because I really wanted to come at it from a different place. I really wanted people to hear me not as like a woke white, you know, liberal elite, but as like the redneck kid from Locust who was misunderstood. And you know what I mean? Like I grew up on Thomas Fight Street on a street lined with Confederate flags. That's where I lived. And I just thought that by trying to communicate the reality of my experience, you know, like I was baptized in the Baptist church and it was all white people, you know, and then we go to the black, you know, go past the black church and it was all black people and we never went to church together. You know, that's the Christianity that I grew up with. White Christianity and black Christianity. It's bonkers. It's fucked up, you know, thinking about all the ways the stories my parents told me, you know, guided me in wrong directions, you know. I say in that song, they try to teach me wrong from right, but their compasses were bad, you know, and it's true. You can't read a newspaper that distills the entire ethic of the All People's Congress to avowed haters of the Klan and come out of it with a nuanced perspective of race relations. That's what's available to you. And so I think that for me, I wanted, and this has been true of me, I mean, I came up in Christianity and making Christian music, and so there's long been a sense of prophetic vision in what I do. I want my songs to be, you know, empowering. I want them to be endowed with a sense of justice. But I also really want them to be medicinal. I want them to serve a purpose. You know, I've never had a lot of interest in writing a really compelling love song. You know what I mean? Or like, I like the idea of creating art that mends a wound. And to me, this was something that was really important to me. And I remember when the song came out, there's a website called Saving Country Music, and this guy Trigger, he wrote about it, and he reviewed my record, and a scathing review, where every time he would say something deeply offensive about it, he would be like, "I hated how much I loved this." You know, he was like really mad at himself for liking my music. But this song really rubbed him the wrong way. And he framed it very specifically and told people that I was, you know, a carpetbagger who was conjuring images of a fictitious South, describing Confederate flags lining the roads, and that I didn't know what I was talking about, and I was out of left pocket, just like... And it really rubbed me the wrong way, because this guy's not from the South. Not at all. Not at all. I grew up throwing kittens on my friends' bare backs to see who could last the longest with kitten claws. I'm a redneck. You know what I mean? Like, my cousins got injured on four-wheelers so many times. Don't act like I didn't grow up on Thomas Fight Street. This is ridiculous, you know? And to have that, you know, to have the song neutered in that way, especially to the exact people who I wanted so much to see me as one of them. You know what I mean? Because I am, not because I'm putting it on. Like, my dad is my dad, and I am who I am. Like, I'm here, you know? And I'm still, I mean, that's still so much of what I do, is to try and create medicine, you know? And I think that was one of the most frustrating experiences for me, that having that medicine just taken away from people who really need it. Because the message of that song is in no way, y'all are racist and you need to get it together. The message is very much like, y'all, I've been reading some stuff and we're being duped. You know what I mean? And we're being made to be jerks. I was finding out what Ta-Nehisi Coates says, that we had engineered our own forgetting. And I was remembering, you know? And sometimes that's it. You know, when Gabor Mate talks about, you know, people think that you don't remember things. You know, you forget things in your youth. And he says, you don't forget anything. Yeah. You can't recall everything, but you do not forget. Right. You remember it. And so it's like bringing that out, you know, really excavating this kind of repressed history, whether it be, you know, the inception of our country, when Howard Zinn describes the indigenous peoples of the Bahamas drowning their babies in the water because they think that's going to be better than what they've seen happen to other people. You know, whether that be unpacking the good ship Jesus, the good ship Jesus that brings over slaves to America for the first time, and they tell them, well, the good ship Jesus is going to come and take you home. And they go out in the fields and they sing songs about the good ship Jesus. And then once they're dead, they tell their kids that those songs were actually about Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And they were actually Christians, and they were actually saved by the grace of God. And they create an entire religion, a sub-religion of black Christianity, using this methodology to subjugate people and keep them oppressed. You know, whether
the God of the slaves is the way historians talk about that, right? It's like we very deliberately, because Christianity, properly understood, includes a lot of potential for liberation, or at
absolutely.
least. And so if you're going, you know, you want to have this captive population, but also have them be nominally Christian, you have to give them a different version of that.
It has to be. It has to be. I don't know. And you know, I think that it gets misconstrued. Like, you know, there's also, I mean, liberation theology is an important history that also exists alongside of this. The civil rights movement exists alongside of this. You know, there's a long history of like black creators and inventors and you know, people navigating the absolute horrors of slavery and coming out on the other side to empower others in really remarkable ways. So, I mean, all that history gets taken from us, and you know what I mean? It's not just the cruelty, but it's also the hope. It's also the resilience and the creativity and the magical way that people can sustain radical joy in the face. I mean, we talk about these gospel songs, these early blues and gospel music that comes out of picking cotton in the fields, but like, it's fucking beautiful music, man. You know what I mean? Like, the capacity for finding ways to make your heart feel light when everything feels overwhelming is a beautiful thing to forget. You know what I mean? And so to me, especially right now, as we're talking about, you know, burning books and removing things from museums and libraries and restructuring the way that we imagine, we are in the process of watching white men trying to engineer their own forgetting once again and bury back up the things that we have exhumed. And so I think that music like this, poetry like this, books like this, journalism like this, anything that is addressing this and holding space for the reality of our history, and not in a way that is saying, you know, people talk to me about white guilt a lot. You know, on TikTok, people are like, why do you have so much white guilt? And it's like, I do not feel guilty for being white. I feel responsibility for being white.
Right.
I feel accountability for being, you know what I mean?
Which that's what people are really trying to escape, right? It's not the
No.
guilt, it's the responsibility.
No, they don't
it's
wanna
that
feel-
you
yeah,
need
right.
to actually do something about this.
Correct. That's the rub. And it's just like, I think it's important. I don't think, I think that there are ways in which we have, I'm going to be careful with this one. I think there are ways in which, like, young white men feel forgotten and ignored and like their voice doesn't matter anymore. Like the identity politics Olympics thing that I referenced earlier. That's like, how can you assist what? Nobody should be distilled and relegated down to their most simple, fucking superficial reality. That's silly. I understand structurally from a systemic lens why it's important and why it's impactful, but I also understand that no amount of women lamenting the cruelty of men has ever like led to meaningful change in men. You know what I mean? Like, it's just a bunch of men who are like, not me. I'm not trying to shame anybody for anything. I think you have to respond to life the way you have to respond to, but there is something about that I think does feel relevant. And I think holding that, I think holding the reality in this song where it says, our ancestors weren't taught the world was so unjust, but it's on us to make it right, is not my way of giving a pass to anybody or excusing anybody's behavior, but really inviting the reality, similarly to where we're living in now, where there are these disparate narratives that are so incompatible that it becomes difficult to hold people to account.
Over the past few years, Adeem has been on the road a lot, playing for a lot of different kinds of crowds. They have had headlining tours and have also opened for friendly artists like the Mountain Goats, Jason Isbell, and Tyler Childers. They're always aware to some degree of being a representative of queer country in those spaces, and the varied reactions that elicits.
The reality is most people don't talk shit in real life. They just don't. I've thought about this before. I don't know if some of it is, my act is I am myself, I think, much more, in my personal life, a lot more androgynous gender-wise than I am. I think my act is actually pretty masculine. I think it's very, the first single that came out was that I Wish You Would Have Been a Cowboy, Toby Keith song. And I think that's an ethos that kind of runs through it, is like, I am willing to be the pro wrestler version. You know what I mean? Like, I don't believe Travis Tritt cares about politics. I don't think it matters to him. I think that Travis Tritt is aging out of a music industry that doesn't respect its elders or care to give people an opportunity to retire or like age gracefully. And he's found the one way he can still get attention in his career. He can't sell tickets or get people to come to shows, but he can run his mouth on Fox News and he gets a little bit of money. And I don't even know how to hold that against him. You know what I mean? We're all kind of struggling to figure out what it looks like to exist in this world. You have no choice but to be an influencer if you want to do the arts anymore. So that's like a whole weird thing. That said, I do think that because I get read as so masculine and I think I'm frequently unsafe. But I don't think I ever carry myself as if I'm unsafe. And I think that kind of makes people not fuck with me. You know what I mean? Most of the time, I would say, especially if I'm opening, I open with 30 to 40% of the room kind of like ready to accept me, and 60 to 70% of the room either really unsure or like hostile. You know what I mean? And that's obviously if I was opening for the Mountain Goats, or like I'm talking about within the genre of country music and kind of Americana, indie, even Isbell Childers. Like I think, even the woke guys like that are doing this kind of music still have a fan base of like all white people, who are like full of implicit biases and, transphobia, anti-trans hate is rooted in deeply white supremacist patriarchal structures. And so even if people aren't intending to be this way, like large swaths of white people in community together are just, they're informed by this in ways they've never even considered. It's just a reality.
Well, I guess maybe a good question to end on, because I feel like you've talked about some of this already. But in looking at the South in particular, and acknowledging that the South is not the only place in America that is dealing with all of these issues we're talking about, but they're heightened here in a lot of ways.
Sure.
What there are plenty of things to look at and be, if you are on the left, and be disheartened by, disgusted by, disappointed by. What gives you hope in the South in particular? What do you see? What do you encounter? What do you hear from people that makes you think that there are ways to make things better?
Well, I'll start by saying something deeply depressing, which is that I was very active in politics a few years ago. And there was a point, especially in the aftermath of the first Trump election, where Republicans began putting money into local elections in a way they hadn't before, which meant Democrats did that, which meant elections that were largely between an establishment candidate and maybe somebody independent who's just like somebody you know in town that owns a business, or you know what I mean, became between a Republican and a Democrat. So you had to vote for some big business person or a real estate agent. That was kind of what happened. And at that point, I became really, really discouraged and disheartened, and I felt very hopeless. I think the renewed sense of hope that I have, and this is not the most encouraging thing to say, but I'm being honest about where I'm at, I really believe that we have so much opportunity to use our creativity to subvert those political systems, and I think that's kind of the history of Appalachia's power in many ways. If you go up to Kentucky, if you go over to North Carolina, go over in East Tennessee after the floods, like it is communities working in collaboration with one another, politics and ideologies aside, to rebuild the basic structures of their lives in the aftermath of tragedy, and this happens like annually in Kentucky now because climate change is ramping up. I feel really concerned about the ways that East Tennessee and Western North Carolina are going to, I worry that this is not an isolated event, that this is a hearkening of a new standard. And we do not have the infrastructure, and we do not have competent leaders to prepare for these sorts of things. I mean, we can't even get salt on the roads in the winter time, and the winters are getting worse. There's more ice on the roads. It is becoming a thing we need. I think that when I think a lot about Borderlands in South Knoxville. Their slogan is "Capitalism for the Greater Good," and they print T-shirts and they print different merchandise items. A lot of what they do is churches. They do their youth group shirts and stuff, and they let addicts and felons and any old person come in. I mean, during the COVID-19, they were getting grants and paying artists to come do murals in their space just to give artists money. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a space that publicly is used. They just needed to help people out. And so I think models of community-centered business applications will be really, really important. I think finding ways, and Christianity has some infrastructure for this, but it's more tied to philanthropy, which I consider to be sort of a massaging arm of capitalism more than an actual tool for the community. Like, what I'm talking about is more direct mutual aid. So, like, I have a record label that I own. All my stuff comes out on that label, and my long-term plan for that is to have all of our things handled by a small team that can kind of cycle through, like, well, if you're not touring right now, you can make T-shirts for somebody that is touring, or you can, you know what I mean? You can press records for somebody for the road, or you can do
Kind of a cooperative model.
very cooperative model. But I also think a lot about like infrastructure for aging musicians. You know, like, do you know how many of us end up just like dying on ice in New Orleans trying to get money for our next fix? Like, that's where most of us end up. You know, most of us don't end up with Hollywood teeth on a fucking major tour. So thinking about those types of things, thinking about, you know, the homeless problem in Knoxville has been completely dismissed by the city and put in the hands of Christian evangelists who are not interested in solving the homeless crisis. They are mitigating a crisis barely, you know, by providing basic services with the hope that they can proselytize their religion. And it's like, we need people who are secular humanists to invest in the infrastructure independent of the political mechanisms to rehabilitate these folks, to give them opportunity to actually get the help that they need, to imagine a future for themselves. You know, I was talking to a transient person who's displaced last night in Knoxville, who, I mean, he doesn't feel like there's any way for him to have a life again. You know, his friends and family are mad at him for smoking meth. They're like, you got to get clean. And he's like, I was clean for 2 years and it was fucking miserable. You know what I mean? What's going to happen when I get clean? You going to help me? You going to give me a life I like? Or no, it's going to be just as sad. Like, I will take the numbing agent if my life is going to be miserable. You know, and to be able to cogently articulate, like, this is where I'm at. Like, do you want me to suffer, or do you want me to, like, feel a little relief? It's like, that's not even addiction that we're talking about. You know what I mean? And it just becomes so clear to me. The hope that I have is in, honestly, in the crumbling infrastructures directing people towards mutual aid, because it's just consistently been the most effective. Like in Appalachia, when you talk about union organizing and laborers like assembling against, you know, corrupt like oligarchs, that's what this is. This is mutual aid. This is people being able to connect on a personal level in their community, and whether they agree or not or anything else, they know that they all deserve basic human dignity and access to a life of quality.
In the absence of broader systemic change.
Yes.
Because the systems don't seem capable of dealing with it.
And so to me, it's like, if you can't get money out of politics, which is ultimately the singular thing that needs to happen before any progressive change actually takes place. If the Democrats were to assume any platform, that's what it would need to be. Like, I won't vote on anything except for removing financial incentives and, you know, money bartering from this fucking equation. That's it. If you can do that, then there's a chance for actual progressive change, because then we can look at things functionally outside of treating it like a business expense, you know? And so I think until that's the law of the land, like, we really, the strongest asset that we have is our capacity to show up for one another and to really embody one another's needs. You know, one thing that American individualism and isolationism has robbed us of is how meaningful and beautiful and edifying it is to care for others. You know, to take it like a mandate to show up as somebody in your community who owns the problems of your neighbor in a way that is serious. You know, there's a very much a sense of like, well, you should go to therapy, and you should, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not knocking going to therapy. I think everybody should be going to therapy, but also, you know, I just switched my weed payment for my therapy payment, and it was higher to go to therapy than it was to smoke weed.
Yeah.
You know, which is, you know, I'm not saying it's not, I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying, like, a lot of people cannot afford to do this kind of thing.
The help that people need isn't easily accessible to a lot of people.
And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to fill those spaces, and I think it means leading with creativity. I think it means listening to each other. I think it means being sensitive and being slower. You know what I mean? And really connected to what's happening right around you. And I think that if we can And I don't think we'll have a choice. I also think things are financially going to become quite bad here. And I think that desperation leads to two opportunities, crime and violence, or like real insulated compassion and mutual aid. I mean, it'll be both, but if we can do everything we can to funnel it into a shared sense of caring and camaraderie and sense of solidarity, I think we're going to be all right. And that is, I guess, where my hope is. My hope is in creative people finding ways to subvert these institutions and create the tangible needs for our community, or create solutions for the tangible needs of our community.
Right. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Adeem, great words. Thanks for the thoughts. Anybody who has not listened to Adeem is also missing out on great music and great songs, and we'll have links to all the places to find that and help support Adeem's career.
Thank you. It's much funnier than it sounds.
Yes, that's the other thing. We've had this very mostly serious conversation. Adeem's songs are also often very funny, as is Adeem if you follow them on social media.
Oh gosh. Thanks, buddy. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate you, friend. It's always nice to talk about things with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much.
And that wraps us up for this extended cut. Thanks, as always, to Bark for our theme music and to our producer, Lord Seth the Libertarian at Barbarian Productions. Remember, you can find Adeem's music and tour dates and more at adeemtheartist.com. We'll talk to you soon.